Welcome, everyone, to the very first Saving Elephants live stream on YouTube. I am so excited for the guests we have lined up for you this evening. All four of us are, broadly speaking, Trump skeptical or possibly even never Trump conservatives who, while very similar, I'm sure have plenty of disagreements around the general subject tonight, which is where do we conservatives go from here? I want to go around the horn and very briefly introduce each guest before I kick off the topic here. First, Justin Stapley. Very good to have you back on the show. Frequent Saving Elephants guest, although we haven't had you on for quite a while. Justin
it's been a bit.
It has been a while. Justin is the editor-in-chief of the Freeman newsletter. Excellent publication, and I really enjoy his work. I'll link to that in the I was going to say the show notes, but this is not a podcast. I'll link to it in the YouTube video after we've posted this. Justin, good to have you back on the program.
Good to be here.
Eric Cohn is, as we were discussing in the green room before we went live, as of Friday, no longer works for the wonderful organization, the Acton Institute. He has actually since taken his job as the chief marketing officer. Have I got that right?
That's right.
Okay, Chief Marketing Officer of Empower Illinois, a school choice not-for-profit there in the state of Illinois. Good to have you back again on the show, Eric.
Good to be here.
And last but certainly not least, one of my former co-hosts in the Are We Right podcast, tragically short-lived Are We Right podcast, the former co-host of the In the Trenches podcast, and frequent guest with myself on the tragically defunct Conservatism on Tap, which I'm starting to notice a pattern here, Cal. Maybe I shouldn't have invited you on. It's maybe a bad omen, but my good friend Cal Davenport, very good to have you with us.
Glad to be here. And, for the record, I think we were so right on Are We Right? The answer to that was such a resounding yes. We didn't have to put anything else out.
That's true. It got to, as Jonah Goldberg would say, there was such violent agreement that it got tedious and a bit pointless. I hope there's not violent agreement on too much of the topic tonight, though. Again, we are in a lot of ways in the same intellectual wheelhouse. I think we are in a lot of ways concerned about the same thing with conservatism. But I've heard, and this can be as narrow a topic as who do you vote for come 2024 between Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, or something broader, just where does the conservative fit in the electoral process? Is the Republican Party the home of conservatism? Is that a failed project? What we're doing here at Saving Elephants, is that a hopeless venture? And I'm not going in any particular order. Any one of you gentlemen are welcome to weigh in, and we'll just have a conversation around this. What do you think the conservative ought to be doing, given I think it's fair to say the less than friendly attitude both major political parties seem to have toward conservatism?
Well, I think I'm pretty solidly on record for looking beyond the immediate unfortunate realities and having a bit of a longer view when it comes to working towards conservatism. I've definitely stirred up the hornet's nest the last couple of weeks by kind of going after the pro-Democrat, never Trumper kind of approach to this, because I just feel like there's not going to be a remnant to rebuild anything if we own what comes for the next 4 years. And that's kind of been my big concern with some of the considerations of what to do moving forward.
There's a great question that there's a great couple of questions that come up on a lot of political polling. They'll ask you specifically whether you'll vote for a specific X candidate, Y candidate. And then they'll say, would you vote for generic Republican or generic Democrat? And I think that if there were such thing as this generic Republican, I could much more easily see recommending that conservatism support that generic Republican, even with some of the recent changes to the party platform. It still has a lot of remnants of what we would probably identify as conservatism, but the specific realities of the candidates that we have are entirely different. So I think that Justin is right, that this isn't just about, generic Republican, generic Democrat, or even the specific candidates that we have on on any given ticket, not just the presidential one, but about building something long term. So what do our actions say about that? What do they say about what we're willing to support, what we're willing to oppose? What are we about? And leaving some sort of legacy of something to pick up when the party or voters, America comes back around to being interested in conservative ideas again.
Well, I think there's two ways of reading your question, and I think you kind of hinted at this. There's what should one do prudentially in the upcoming election, and then there is the long-term interest of, part of the problem here I also find is terminological. You say conservatism, and there used to be a generally well-accepted broad consensus on what that was. And I don't know that that really exists anymore. I personally have gotten to the point where, I don't even know what word I want to choose to describe myself. There's a definition of conservatism that works. I've called myself a libertarian in the past. That's, I'm probably more conservative than most of my libertarian friends. There's any of this stuff without a classical liberalism running through it utterly is uninteresting to me and not worth defending. So I think part of it is once trying to figure out, well, what group of conservatives or what kind of conservatism are we even talking about here? So that's, I think, one of the questions that we have to answer. The prudential question I find mildly interesting, and I find it mildly interesting because I live in Michigan, and Michigan is a state that actually matters in this upcoming election. And as Josh mentioned, I'm now working for an organization in Illinois. I spent most of my life in Illinois. I spent most of my life since I could vote, voting for Republicans and having my vote canceled out somewhere around like 3.5 to 1. So this is the first time that I've ever lived in a state where it kind of mattered what I wanted to do with my vote. So in a weird way, up until I guess the VP pick, I thought for a while, like, well, I'm for once maybe some kind of a gettable voter. Not impressed with the Walz pick. And I don't know that I'm all that compelled by the argument that what my individual vote is going to represent is all that meaningful. Again, I don't know where everybody else comes down on this, but my position since 2016 is that Donald Trump is unfit to be president of the United States. My position since 2020 has been that the guy who tried to steal an election cannot be president of the United States again. The implication of that is pretty clear, that the Democrat needs to win. I mean, for reasons that we don't need to get into, there really only are two options in our system. What we do after that, the problem with answering that question is, what does the outcome of the election look like? If Trump wins, it's a completely different conversation. If he loses narrowly and we have another long relitigation of the election being stolen, well, that's another completely different set of circumstances. And if somehow it's like a Democratic landslide, I think we've all kind of taken the Republican landslide kind of off the table since Biden dropped out. I don't think we're going to see a landslide either way, but does anybody really think that Donald Trump's influence over this party is going to be diminished after this? And I just don't see anything in the evidence leading up to now to suggest to me that it is going to be diminished. So we're still going to have to contend with that element of the party, that element of conservatism, that element of whatever it is we want to call this world. And we don't know how strong or weak they're going to be. So there's just, to me, a whole lot that's left to be determined once we even figure out, kind of what we're talking about.
You are correct, Eric, in that my question is deceptively multifaceted, I suppose. Historically, look, and I don't know how you gentlemen act. Eric, you had mentioned this to me, and I think we have had conversations with all four of us. I did not vote for Trump or Hillary in 2016. I didn't vote for Trump or Biden in 2020. Now, I live in Oklahoma. Justin, you live in Utah. Cal and Eric, you're both in Michigan. And granted, probably in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter that's not actually going to tip the election. But I actually do think there is a difference, a sort of awareness of, look, if the election were up to me, I think I would have a moral obligation to make and I only had, choice A or B, I think I would have a moral obligation to make a choice between them. But knowing that it's not up to me, and especially knowing that I live in a state in which it is so skewed, whether that was red or blue, My bigger concern is I don't want to participate in the perception of the groundswell of the support behind candidate A or B. And so I guess I'm opening this up because I have friends who are very principled, and they are tormented by this idea that you don't vote, or that you would cast away a vote, or that you would intentionally vote for someone you don't actually want to be the president in order for someone else not to get there. And so I'm just kind of curious, because I don't know, maybe you gentlemen do struggle with that. I haven't really, as much as some others I've noticed, as politically engaged as I am. It doesn't bother me. It bothers me when these individuals are on the ticket. I really wish there were other choices, but it doesn't bother me to say I can't in good faith say that either of them are deserving of this office. I don't mean that in some purest sense. I just mean, Eric, let's just talk about Trump for a moment. He was unqualified in 2016. Absolutely agree. Maybe he could have in those 4 years done something to demonstrate, okay, he can do this job with a certain level of proficiency. But 2020, I think, was completely disqualifying for a completely different reason, that having to do with his response to the election. Again, the Democrats, completely different conversation. But I guess I want to get into that, this whole notion of maybe not what we conservatives do in the future, and we can get back to that issue. But is it right or wrong to vote in these kind of strategic, almost Machiavellian, proceduralist ways? Is this something that's more honorable that we ought to be taking almost as it would be sacrilegious, say, to do what I'm suggesting? Where do you guys come down on that?
I, as somebody who's grown up in Michigan, I've been in Michigan my whole life, and so my vote has always been in some sort of swing state, some sort of like my vote has mattered. And one of the things that I've come to realize over the last several years, since at least 2016, is that neither party wants to earn my vote, and both of them think they're entitled to it on the basis of who the other party is. And nobody's doing the work to actually positively work towards mine. So I think about the fact that even in a swing state like mine, my one vote isn't going to decide the election. I can act as though the vote itself does, and I think there's a compelling argument to that. But I can also think about what it means symbolically for me to vote one way or another, or to vote for a third party, or to abstain. In 2016, I abstained. In 2020, I voted third party. This time around, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do yet, and I don't know when I'm going to know what I'm going to do yet. It might be while I'm standing in the booth, for all I know. But I think that just like your question is multifaceted, that what we do with our vote in situations where we are so repulsed by our options is that there's more than one facet to it. There's more than one direction we could take it, and it depends on what matters most to each of us with our vote. That's, I guess, sort of what it's for.
Yeah, I've always been a vote your conscience kind of guy. Each person has to wrestle with all the different things that matter to them, all the different situations that are going on. And I've never been a person who believes in judging people based on how they voted, because that's on them. That's what they chose to do. Something that we are big on in the Army is that if you're going to bring up a problem, you sure as heck better bring a solution to the table with the problem. And so right now, I can't go to people and say, hey, don't vote for Biden or don't vote for Trump if I don't have any other option to give them, right? And so I just have to, that's pretty much what I just have to say, like, hey, you do you, vote your conscience. But I think that's a very different consideration from a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, especially online, with actually carrying water for very, very poor candidates, actually going out there and being a booster and trying to help them get them over the finish line. Because that's where I think the problem is. That's where my concern grows from having the ability to even have a hope of a conservative renewal whenever we have the opportunity to do it, is, once again, if we decide, like, hey, like I talked to a lot of people who say, you know what, don't like Trump, hate the guy, wish he wasn't running again, but dang, look at some of these Supreme Court ideas that the Democrats are floating around. hey, the Democrats may seem the nicer party, but if you get down on their ideology, they seem a bit more radical. And you look at Trump's, Supreme Court picks, like there's definitely an argument to be made for the lesser of evil argument for Trump from a certain perspective. But then I say, yeah, if you want to vote that way, that makes sense. Do what you need to do. But do you want to go out there and actively support him and then own whatever happens next? And then the same can be said for Kamala Harris, right? You can, I think it's a perfectly reasonable, if this guy is no longer surrounding himself with good people. His second term isn't going to be like his first term. This guy has complete contempt for the U.S. Constitution. He should not be in the White House. I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. Yeah, that makes sense too. But once again, don't go out there and engage in that partisan mind. Don't be a foot soldier, because you're going to end up owning whatever comes the next 4 years, and people are going to remember what you did. And that's my big concern, is like what you do in the polling booth is between nobody but you, God, whatever you believe in. No one else has ownership of that. And you should feel free to do whatever you feel like you need to do, given all these different circumstances. But avoid that partisan mindset. Avoid the willingness to set aside what you actually believe and attach to something that is counter to what you believe. And don't go out there and just, aid in giving a mandate to governance that, however way you cut it, it's going to be a rough 4 years.
For Kamala, let me say this about Kamala Harris is I think she is a bad politician. I think she is a bad candidate. I think she has been bad in office. That said, I think probably it would be better if she won. And I go back to that line from PJ O'Rourke in 2016 on Hillary Clinton, that she's terrible, but within normal parameters. And I think Kamala Harris starts to push those normal parameters. But again, the kind of horrible choice that we have been given here is between that or somebody who the last time around tried to steal an election, which is more disqualifying to me personally than any of the facts that, I think Kamala Harris is both poor at politics, and the extent that she has any core beliefs, they are, way further to the left than any of my core beliefs. But there is something to be said for the fact that she has been flip-flopping, even if it has been coming only through kind of staff press releases, on a lot of the things that she took some very hardline left-wing positions on. It is kind of weird to see people, somebody actually trying to tack to the center and trying to find a way to win an election in a more normal way. So the hypocrisy of that, there are a lot of people who spend a whole lot of time, what is the term from the Red Scare podcast, truffle swines for hypocrisy. I find that work utterly uninteresting, and I think hypocrisy is generally overrated in importance by people who think that it is just this sin in politics that you should not be able to overcome. It's perfectly fine for politicians to be hypocrites, especially when they're pivoting to things that are more palatable to you. So I think the big point that I want to make here is the role of what people like us I think are supposed to do is be able to say those things that are true and to not be just water carrying partisans for one side or the other. Even if, and I don't know that anybody else is as persuaded, not that I think I'm actually persuaded at this point, but inclined towards the idea that it is better that Harris wins. It's still perfectly fine and should be perfectly fine to say she's probably going to be terrible. But the alternative, considering, as we try to project forward, what might a second Trump term look like? What kind of people may staff it? Are there any things that may keep him within bounds, like he kept him in bounds in the previous 4 years? It's not going to be a concern about getting reelected if he wins a second term. So could he go hog wild on court nominations? Or some of the things that people thought were kind of guarantees the last time around are much less guarantees now. So it's a mess, and it's just a godforsaken, disappointing mess. And if we were to return to the bigger picture question of this, where do we go from here? The thing that I'm most interested in, and it's fascinating to watch the Democrats actually eject somebody who was, the sitting president of the United States as a nominee. That is the party reasserting itself. Reforming the way that these parties select candidates is, I think, one of the most important things that needs to be done. I don't know how to do it. I mean, if I had solutions to a lot of this stuff, I'd be making a lot more money and doing a lot different work than the kind of work that I'm actually doing. I don't know how you pull that off. But finding a way to empower the parties more so we could get some better options than what we have, so that we don't have to hem and haw, and or at least I don't have to hem and haw in the way that I have been about these two candidates. I hated a lot of previous options, but the parameters in which I hated them were just completely different than this.
Eric, you're making a lot of really interesting points that I do want to delve into, but I want to return to you, Justin, because you said something that kind of struck a chord with me in this, and I agree with you that who you vote for in that voting booth is between you and God. It's right. It's not I try very hard, presuming we don't have the reanimated corpse of Joseph Stalin on the ballot, to not judge someone for voting for a candidate that I wouldn't have wanted them to vote for. That being said, it has not gone unnoticed, and I think it's Yuval Levin that kind of talks about this very often, about the cynicism that creeps into an individual when they make a decision one way or another. If you think about, we lived in a different world in 2016. Donald Trump may have been the same Donald Trump, but it was not hard to find a fellow Republican who are like, look, I can't stand the guy, but I'm afraid of Hillary Clinton. So I'm going to vote for Trump, and then I'm going to work to hold his feet to the fire to make sure that he doesn't stray from a traditional conservative mold. Where is that Republican today? Like that is a very rare individual who has the same amount of disdain for Trump that they did in 2016, but sees that, look, we can work with the guy, we can hold them to a standard. It's almost Trump has changed them rather than them holding Trump to a standard. So the reason I'm saying all this is, while I agree with you, is it reasonable to suggest that an individual could make a decision like this and then not somewhat reverse engineer actually become someone who, in other words, is the act of voting for someone the first step toward carrying water for individuals?
Yeah, that's actually, so me personally, I wrote in Calvin Coolidge in 2020. I'm probably going to write in Ronald Reagan this year, because that is my personal view. I view my vote as an endorsement. And if someone hasn't earned my vote, then they don't get it. And that's kind of me. I feel like I have, especially since I've delved more academically into being a political theorist and different things, I've just come to the conclusion that negative partisanship is just corrupting our system terribly, for various different reasons. And you mentioned one of the reasons is people went into the voting booth in 2016 saying, well, I really wish this Trump guy wasn't the guy I was voting for, and he's probably going to lose, but I definitely can't vote for Hillary, and I don't want to throw away my vote, so let's vote for Trump. All of a sudden, the next morning, he won. And immediately, that makes a change in people's brain, right? Immediately, they went from, we were going to lose, we were going to have 4 years of Hillary Clinton, to, oh my gosh, Donald Trump won. He won, and now we get 4 years of Donald Trump, and he's going to deliver us some conservative victories, and he's going to have Supreme Court judges. And it completely changed how everybody thought about him, right? There was a time in 2016 where the majority of the Republican Party was never Trump. Like you can see it in the results. Donald Trump didn't get over 50% in the primary vote. And now it feels like just banging your head against a wall to even dare claim that you don't support Trump, back when everybody recognized he was a lesser evil. Now he's a greater good, right? And that's part of the thing that corrupts the whole system. I've gone so far as in some of my recent writing to argue that the democratic process is being corrupted by the negative partisanship, because the whole point of democracy is representation, right? But if we're voting against people instead of for people, then the people who are getting elected are not representing almost anybody. It's not actually a representative system. And the problem that I keep seeing is, as the negative partisanship continues in election cycle after election cycle, both parties are being taught the lesson that I don't have to earn your vote. I just have to point out how terrible the other side is. And that's going to keep happening until finally enough people say, you know what? No, you got to earn my vote. So while I say, hey, the voting booth, it's your choice. It's vote your conscience and whatnot. I'm mostly saying that by trying to make the point that I don't own your vote. I don't, just because I care about a certain issue, I don't get to say, hey, if you were conservative like me, then this is how you're supposed to vote, because I don't think that's right. But I do agree with cautioning people and saying, maybe be a little bit more willing to say, I'm going to refrain from adding my name to a mandate for governance that I don't support. And I think we need to think a little bit more along those lines. But once again, I'm not going to sit there and say that you have to listen to me. I'm just explaining that's how I view my vote. That's how I view the situation.
I appreciate Justin's write-in votes taking the narrative from this presidential campaign up until recently and totally turning it on its head. Joe Biden, not old enough. Give me Ronald Reagan. Give me Calvin Coolidge. Give me people who actually are no longer alive and with us.
Heck yes.
One of our generation's great conservatives, Jonah Goldberg, often points out that one of the defining features of conservatism is this ability to hold contradictory ideas at the same time. And he points out that it's really hard. People don't naturally want to do it. We want to reconcile the contradictions. We want to justify our actions and our decisions. It's a very natural part of human nature to say, I took this action, I need to make it make sense. And so it is very difficult to hang on to, I think, the thread of this is my pragmatic vote, but I'm not going to become a cheerleader on one side or another. Trying to step back and hold on to that objectivity towards both sides. I think that's extremely difficult. And I think that sort of paradoxically, we really hate negative partisanship individually. We don't want to just say, I voted against so-and-so. You want to say, I voted for so-and-so. Maybe we could change, maybe that's a way we could alter democracy. Everybody has to vote against somebody, and the person who gets the least votes against them wins. But the way that it's set up is that you are voting for somebody. You are endorsing somebody with that vote on some level. You're endorsing a strategy, a pragmatic way of doing things. And the question is that something that is compelling enough to keep us in the same within the same philosophy after we do it, or are we going to be dragged from one side to the other? I haven't voted for, I don't think I've ever voted for a president who's won. And so it's hard to say that I know exactly how that feels. But it's a strong pull, I think to make our actions make sense to ourselves, especially, and to our conscience and to others. So what do we do with that? I just think we need to be honest with ourselves about why we're doing what we're doing and keep ourselves honest instead of in an echo chamber, or then be willing to live with the contradiction.
So I will note, I have voted for twice the winning presidential candidate. It was the first two times that I ever voted, and both times were George W. Bush. I felt very content about those outcomes. I really didn't know a whole lot when I voted in 2000, but knew a lot more in 2004 and was more than content with that vote. Although I was much more of a partisan kind of guy at the time. I mean, in 2004, I was working for the Cook County Republican Party, to the extent that such an organization does now or has ever existed. It is Chicago. But I personally got pretty disaffected after that with how disastrous Bush's second term was. I still have a lot of admiration for the man himself, But the second term was really a disaster and going to set the table for the course and the trajectory that we've been on ever since, with the rise of Obama. And I don't think without Obama and some of the ways that, very subtle ways that he knew how to troll people on the right, I don't think you get the reaction that nominates Donald Trump without Barack Obama. So you can trace a line of these things. It wasn't inexorable that we were going to end up here, but it is kind of the way that we did. So I guess, the caution I would have is that, having voted twice for someone who did win, I don't know how I like how it turned out afterwards. So one of the things I think I struggle with a lot in all of this is that question of what I'm going to do individually with my vote, because I've expressed a general preference for which way I would like to see the outcome of this election go. And in a way, I don't kind of feel having a preference for that all that comfortable, being like, I want other people to do all of that work for me. Even though my one vote is not going to decide anything, it's kind of like, I really want this to happen, but I want to keep my hands perfectly clean and all of that. Which is why I find arguments over what one individual does with their vote to be not particularly all that helpful. I just don't know what it's really revealing there. People are going to vote the way that they're going to vote, and I think that's really up to them. As back when the years when I didn't vote at all, my general answer to that was, given my line of work, I've been at places like the Foundation for Economic Education and the Illinois Policy Institute and the Acton Institute, kind of in the professional liberty nonprofit movement. And I would always say I do more before lunch to advance the ideas that I believe in than I've ever done by voting, or anybody ever will by casting one single vote. So I think the voting thing is semi-interesting, but it's to me kind of the interplay between, okay, you vote for or against a candidate based on that motivation. For people like us, it's not as much of a partisan thing. It perhaps is more strategic. Everybody will have their reasons, but I think this takes us back to the original question, which is, okay, well, what do we do from here to try to shape some better outcomes in the future, so we aren't having this kind of terrible choice between, I think these two people are god awful, and I'm trying to determine which one is a little bit better maybe than the other, and making a choice accordingly.
Eric, I am with you in that I did vote for a presidential candidate twice who won, George W. Bush. I think that says less about the difference in our voting patterns and maybe those of Cal's and possibly Justin's, and more to the fact of who are the older people in this conversation. If I remember correctly, when I had you on Saving Elephants, I entitled that episode "Geriatric Millennials."
Yes,
we're really pushing that edge of the millennial generation. But I'm glad you brought that up, because it calls to mind something that I think is easy for us to lose sight of, and I'm certainly guilty of this too. The failure of the Bush administration, in part, I noticed, I really believe, because I was never part of the Tea Party, but I went to some of the organizations. It was interesting. It was this kind of bizarre groundswell grassroots effort. I'd never seen anything like this. And it just felt so palpable that what is going on here is more than a reaction to the left and Barack Obama. There was a pressure cooker in that last 4 years of the Bush administration that was released under Obama. And I think you're right. You don't get a Donald Trump had we not gone through the 8 years of Obama. I would even add to that, I don't think you get it without a John McCain and a Mitt Romney, who were perceptively these colossal establishment failures, if you will, in those 8 years. And the reason I'm saying all that, and maybe in view of where do we go from here, is part of my concern is there's this understandable lack of imagination of what would the world look like, what could it have looked like different for conservatives, say, because it can't simply be us saying we're against Trump, therefore let's go back to George Bush 2004, right? There has to be some sort of an alternative path of us at least having some clear sense of how we can communicate to others, here's where the right got off track. And even though I don't want to go back, even though it was honorable, right? Even though it may have had some good parts to it, here's how we recognize the seeds of Trumpism or MAGAism, in a sense, were born there. And here's how we avoid that going forward.
I want to say one thing, and then I'm going to get out of the way for Cal and Justin. The point that you made about McCain and Romney, and even kind of the nature of this conversation that we're currently having, one of the things I think we need to remember is, yes, Those two candidates lost the presidential election to Barack Obama, who, as much as I was never a fan, he is a unique political talent. And in a way, it was not, it was not shameful to have lost those elections. Meanwhile, Republicans were incredibly successful in congressional elections, in state gubernatorial elections, in state legislative elections. This narrative that persisted out there that conservatives, Republicans, and I think we should take some care to draw a line in between the interests of those two groups of people. They sometimes overlap, but they are not the same. Were incredibly successful on all kinds of levels. And somehow losing two presidential elections to a unique political talent broke a lot of people's brains to make them think that somehow our side never wins. It was not true. It never was true. And while you can fault McCain and you can fault Romney for ways they ran those elections, there were probably mistakes that they made and choices that they probably should have made differently. It wasn't nearly as catastrophic as it is often suggested. That was just Republicans taking an unending beating for 8 years. It is not true, and we should remember it accurately.
And Eric, I will get out of the way too, so that Cal and Justin can get a word in here. But thank you for saying that. I think we're probably on the same page here, because I think you're factually right, but I think you'd also agree with this. The right felt like we lost. The right felt like it was a colossal failure.
Well, this is my point about the overvaluing of the presidency. And I think that there's reasons to care a lot about the presidency because of how powerful it is, because Congress continues to hand its power over to the executive branch on a regular basis. It's not that we shouldn't care about it. It's just we should put it in context of the other things. And if you have controlling majorities in both houses of Congress and a president from the other party, there's not a lot that they can do that you don't want to have happen. So I think we should remember that it was a very successful time for Republicans, even if they never won the White House in those two election terms. Someone else talk.
In those 2 years, in some ways, it's the right person at the wrong time. I think Romney in 2016 is a landslide. And I think McCain probably had kind of a Biden effect where he probably should have been the nominee earlier. Maybe he was a little bit past his time. At the same time, I think in some ways, both Bush and McCain kind of sacrificed the 2000 election on the fact that they felt the Iraq surge was necessary. The Iraq surge did do a lot of good things, and McCain was unwilling to criticize it. And democracies have war fatigue. It's just how it goes. And in 2008, America was sick of feeling like they were perpetually at this war footing. They wanted something different. McCain was kind of just offering a continuation of Bush. And like you said, Obama was this unique political figure, very unique political talent. And then in 2012, I don't know that any Republican beats Barack Obama, because I just don't think America wanted history to record them booting the first African-American president out of office. I think a lot of people's votes really came down to that. And you can kind of understand why, because a lot of people were like, we have there was this hope that in a lot of ways Barack Obama's presidency was this moment of healing for the country. Unfortunately, that proved to not be the case at all. Because of some of the things President Obama did himself, unfortunately. But getting back to kind of the broader conversation, when I look at the next 4 years, with whatever happens this fall, I kind of have this sense of winter is coming, no matter who sits on the Iron Throne. And in some ways, I feel like arguing over who's going to sit on that throne is maybe a bit of a distraction when we need to be preparing for the storm that's coming. And maybe that's where the conversation should be as to what do we do next. Is like, if the hurricane is coming and you can't stop it from coming, it's time to be like, okay, do I have food? Do I have water? And that's where I kind of feel like the conservative remnant needs to be, is like, okay, no matter what happens, what do we do to try to be able to spark a renewal, whether it's next year, 4 years, 10 years, whether it's 1972 and we're just a few more election cycles away from Reagan, or whether it's 1958 and we're starting the National Review and hoping that something comes of this. That's kind of where I feel like we're at in a lot of ways in the true movement conservatism.
Your analogy now is to be very concerned that the end of this election is going to be just as bad as season 8 of Game of Thrones. So this is a new level of fear that you have imputed into me.
Will
the wheel isn't going to get broken. We're just going to
I think that to carry that analogy forward a little bit, I think one of the things that we need to do is maybe to stockpile not food and water and that sort of thing, but stockpile ideas to be picked up again. I think that just like with elections, there are just different periods in time when the people will say, since we're sort of in a populist moment, we move in different directions and care about different things, and sometimes that kind of draws us away from traditional conservative ideas, and sometimes we're brought back to that. And when people, the voting populace is back in that place again, what are they going to pick up? They're going to need ideas, philosophies, policy, conservatism that they can latch onto and become inspired by again. I think so I have a two-pronged approach there, and one of them is that stockpiling of conservative ideas and policies, and the other one is to sort of connect to a string that Eric brought up. Remember that the presidency and hopefully the executive branch doesn't matter as much as people think it does, and instead focus on things that are local. Your community, family, church. I think actually an underrated one is just like your city, your the development of your community and where you live. And I think that we can also sort of not so much stockpile, but continue to amass successes at the local level of conservative ideas. We preach all the time that we don't want a big government. We'd rather have government be more involved where it's smaller and closer to the people. So let's do that. Let's show that it works. Let's build some sort of shelter, maybe a gigantic wall. I don't know. I'm thinking of some sort of show or analogy here to keep out.
Yeah, I was gonna say, who's the Night King in this analogy here?
So and just to preserve some things until sort of there's the opportunity to put the knight of conservatism back on the horse, so to speak.
I'm going to guess that half of us, at least, have read Matt Continetti's book, The Right. If you're out there and you have not, Cal, get a copy. It's great. One of the things that really heartened me about that is the way that Matt documented these kinds of populist insurgencies that would, come up every once in a while within the greater history of the political right, and would more or less get, kind of subsumed into the system itself. It surges, it gets absorbed, the stew gets mixed a little bit differently. Some different flavors come out of it in the mixing of this new populist wave into it. I think that's one of the things, at least historical pattern suggests, that's what we would possibly see there. So it's one of the things that always kind of gives me some hope in thinking about what the future could hold. That, yes, it seems like it's forever when you're living through it, but when you look back at 100-year history of all of this stuff, and it's like, yeah, these things come in waves. We're just in the middle of one of them, and it seems like it's never going to crash, and it may crash before we expect that it will. And I think one of the things that may be really interesting to see is if we have had these massive turnout elections, presidential elections, if we see a huge decline in turnout here, I'm wondering how people are going to feel about that afterwards, where it's like we keep getting told how important it is. And if a whole bunch of voters just finally goes like, you know what, forget it. I don't want any part of this. I'm not even going to participate. Things kind of recede back to the mean of voter participation. And people have to look around and go, okay, so we're not motivating people anymore with it's death and destruction if either of these candidate wins. And maybe they have to start recalibrating their pitches and pitching themselves in different, more productive ways.
Eric, so long as you're going to inject some optimism to the conversation, I think I'll pull us back into some negative territory here. Because I've often wondered if elections, historically speaking, no matter how clever our ideas, no matter how grand the strategy, usually comes down to historical accidents and events nobody can foresee coming. But one thing that I think that we can foresee coming, because it's the world's most predictable train wreck, is the national debt. Now, I don't mean by that I am smart enough, and I don't tend to trust people who claim to be smart enough to know exactly what that means, whether or not that means we're headed towards some sort of a fiscal cliff in which no one can deny this was a horrible thing, we amassed so much debt, or whether or not it means we just go through generations of stagnation, kind of as the economist David Bahnsen calls it, the Japanification of the economy, where there's just low growth, no growth for years. But I do suspect, I don't know this, but I do suspect that there's going to come some moment in time in which there's going to be a day of reconciliation. And whichever Team Red or Team Blue is holding the bag in that moment is probably going to be, rightly or wrongly, blamed for it. And so I say this in a very practical sense. Is there something we conservatives, who have been pretty serious and consistent on this issue, can be doing today so that not at all a sort of I told you so, but more of a so that when we are taken seriously, our ideas will have more force because individuals will see, wow, getting off this, getting so far from what the traditionalist conservative have argued for so long has very profound negative consequences, and it is now time for us to look for an alternative.
If there's anything that I wish we would be more like the ancient Greeks about, it's in thinking of history as cycles, as opposed to always going from one direction to another. When it comes to what do we do, I'm an advocate of just making sure that your ideas get out there so that when the cycle takes the turn, it's out there. It's something for people to then say, hey, these people have been talking about this for a while. Let's give them a try now. Because, Eric mentioned the cycles of populism. And I think it's important to recognize that populism is a political phenomenon more than it is an ideology. It can take many different forms. It can be left, it can be right. And usually at its basis, at its foundation, are actual, real, legitimate concerns that for whatever reason have gone under the radar, isn't being talked about by anybody, isn't being focused on. And so the people that have those concerns, they end up feeling like the system doesn't care about me. The people in power are against me. And the longer that goes on, the more likely it is that some demagogue is going to show up on scene who's then going to burst us into this big populist moment. And when the populist moments end, it's usually because not that they've been defeated, but that somebody other than the demagogue has shown up with actual solutions to the real problems that then give them a more healthy way to go about trying to answer these concerns. And this has been my big frustration with a lot of the quote unquote Never Trump movement over the last 10 years, is the tact has been, these people are evil, these people are terrible, and they have to be beaten, they have to be silenced, and then once that thing is unraveled and they've been put in their place, then we can rebuild something. And that's why populism has continued to grow, win, lose, or draw. Trump lost in 2020. He's more popular now, I would argue, than he was in 2020, because 4 years under Joe Biden reinforced all of the reasons why this populist moment has happened. And that's one of the reasons why when I look at the next 4 years, I have a hard time saying what's going to happen, what's going to be worse, what's going to be better. Because it's like, sure, I can pretty confidently say that another 4 years of Trump is going to be bad. I can pretty confidently say that he's going to be a lot more unhinged than he was 4 years ago. Very much. But at the same time, the worst thing that ever happened under Trump happened because he lost. So how do we know for sure what is going to happen this fall, no matter who wins, no matter what happens? I just think it's going to be ugly. And that's why, I feel like we need to think of it more in terms of how do we address the root causes that led to Trump? And how do we need to go about behaving ourselves politically? How do we go about advocating for conservative ideas so that we can address the root causes instead of, I feel like, inadvertently fanning the flames, which I think in a lot of ways is what has happened by thinking that the Democratic Party in any way gives us a solution to what's happened in the last decade.
I agree with most of that. I think I agree with all of it, but I also I find it hard to decide exactly how to walk the tightrope of addressing legitimate concerns while at the same time not excusing people for putting Trump in office in the first place, or trying to send him back after what he did after 2020. And we can talk about the Democratic Party in the same breath as well. But my point being, at what point do we? How much do we excuse voters who have the power to make these decisions and make them some very egregiously bad ones? I mean, it's not, Trump doesn't get elected because he's Trump. He gets elected because voters like that he's Trump. On some level. He can't put himself in office. Somebody else, to paraphrase Barack Obama, somebody else made that happen, right? So a whole lot of other people made that happen. And if it happens again, it will be because of voters. And there's not an excuse merely because it's a populist moment, or merely because there are problems that have gone unaddressed by the ivory tower elites in Washington, that somehow none of these things justify voting for somebody like Trump or somebody worse or somebody just as bad to defeat Trump or whatever. Like, none of those things in themselves are excuses, even though they are, we could say, valid concerns, even though they are things that need to be addressed pragmatically. How do we pragmatically do it without somehow aiding and abetting the decision making of voters who made not just misguided, but some pretty institutionally damaging choices over the last 8 years or so?
Well, I think as I've talked to different people, it only takes about a 10-minute conversation with most people, and you can dial in on whether or not they're what you might call a true believer, MAGA, populist, national conservative, however you want to term it, or whether they're just proceeding on a different set of facts than what we're proceeding on. And I don't say that in like they have their own facts. I'm just saying that their understanding of the facts. I've long held that the rise of Trumpism and of MAGA populism is much more a propaganda coup than it is a true ideological shift amongst most Republicans and conservatives. To give you an example, as I engaged with the Political Action Committee, the Reagan Caucus, over this last summer, and I went to Republican conventions here in Salt Lake and other places in Utah and advocated for more Reaganite type conservatives within the Republican Party. I would hand out flyers and I would put the map from 1984 and I would say, remember when Republicans won like this? and that was kind of my big opening, foray into talking to people. And almost everybody was receptive because they're like, yeah, we like Reagan. And then all of a sudden, here comes along a guy wearing the MAGA red hat with this big chip on his shoulder and a scowl on his face. And I hand him the flyer and he says, Reagan? We're not interested in Reagan anymore. Reagan is dead. His ideas are old. What are you doing here? And all of a sudden, everybody else who's surrounding me kind of gets this weird look on their face and goes, I thought we liked Reagan. And there's this reality that a lot of Republican voters just don't understand that there's this difference between the populism that has risen in the last 10 years and the conservatism that they think they're still a part of. And I think in some ways we've been unable to break through a lot of the right-wing infotainment static to help voters understand that they have a choice. Because a lot of voters feel like they have to vote for Trump because they have no choice. And that's one of the big problems. Now, I understand that we shouldn't shy away. Like in that situation, if the MAGA person wants to say, I'm going to challenge you what's going on, I'm going to call him out. I'm going to challenge him. If people ask me, like, why wouldn't you support Trump? I tell them, hey, Trump is a conservative, and here's the reasons why. I guess I'm just more interested in a renewal than I am in a reckoning. And so I worry a little bit less about making sure that pain is felt for decisions made. But I think a lot of it is just sticking to your guns and calling the balls and strikes, right? I think there is a problem. I think the path that you're worried about going down is perhaps the path that we can observe that Mike Lee has gone down. because he tried, right, saying, oh, there's this nationalist populist moment. And if I can just direct the flow towards my brand of constitutionalism, I'm going to be able to accomplish a lot. And all of a sudden, 8 years later, it's like he seems to have forgotten about all the things that he said he stood for, or as I suspect, he ended up caring more about isolationism than he did about constitutionalism. But we want to make sure, like you said, we don't want to sit there and say, well, we don't want to pander to people. I guess maybe that's the thing. Like, we can trust people to be adults, to give them the truth, and not pander to them to believe that that's what we have to do in order to persuade them, I guess, is part of the big thing we got to focus on.
I feel the need to interject here. The first thing that I would always say to the summer intern class at Acton, when I would give them my marketing presentation course, seminar they would take in the summer, which is, the four of us here, we're weird. The things that we care about in terms of idea structures and, intellectual history and all of that, most people do not care about. The conservatism of a lot of those voters, to the extent they describe themselves as such, is instinctual. It is a bit more in line with kind of like George Will's conservative sensibility, although most of them probably could not articulate it that way. But it is this just kind of idea of the old and tried over the new and untried. And I like to, I like things as they are. It's some status quo bias that's in there as well. And for most people like that, for the normies that are out there, and for a lot of them, it was looking at, they're inclined in one direction, red or blue. And this Trump guy was entertaining, and he was interesting, and he was something different, and he was willing to say the things that they were told that they were never supposed to say, but that they felt. The opportunity would, at least what we thought we were going to get with some campaign like Ron DeSantis's, in order to be like, okay, we don't need to have like, a truth and reconciliation committee or anything like that. We're just going to move on, and we're going to try to bring some of these ideas into the party, and we're going to try to move on with a different character. And voters are like, no, we still want the same other guy. My fear in all of this is that the only way that we're ever getting beyond Donald Trump is that the man passes from this earth. That really is my concern, that there is no kind of loss that would be, we really have kind of violated what to me were always what I took to be the rules of how things worked, at least within the Republican Party generally. When you lost, you were kind of on the outs, and we didn't want to hear from you for a while. But that whole thing has gotten overturned. So my enduring fear is that we're not going to get beyond Trump until the man passes. But if you care about conservatism and you want to make these kind of differentiations or at least to articulate the interaction that the kind of intellectual conservatism that we're interested in, where it comes to play with politics and political parties, there are a lot of people that even if I agree, I don't like what they empowered, but it's going to kind of be like, yeah, this wasn't great. But the more that we try to relitigate all of that, rather than try to move it forward and try to redirect it to something more productive, is going to be, I think, a fraught thing to engage in.
A lot of this.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and Justin, this is kind of I do agree with your sentiment that I want a renewal, not a reckoning. And I certainly know that there are, and I think I speak for all four of us, that there are those never Trumpers who it does in fact seem like their abiding passion is the reckoning. It's the Trump.
The people who want to burn it all down as if they could.
As if they could, right? And I think, and that's,
I love that, as if they could. Yep.
As if they could, and that's actually, I'm glad you put it that way, because I think that is kind of my concern. We are the people who want a renewal as if we could. Right, we're not in the driver's seat. We're not in this position to instruct other people, if you will, or push this in a certain direction. And I'm, and maybe most of this conversation has been about that very conundrum. Right, get your ideas out there, behave with integrity, be consistent, and be hopeful that there is a future in a brighter tomorrow. And I know we're coming up close on the clock here, so I guess I'll go around the horn, just ask for any, because I'm sure that there's so many things. We haven't actually answered the question, I don't think, exhaustively or satisfactorily. Where does the conservative?
As if we could.
As if we could, right.
Nope.
Right. I think you gentlemen have been incredibly insightful, but I do want to give you an opportunity, each of you, to briefly give, I guess, closing arguments, if you will, before we call it a night here.
Who's starting? I guess I'll start. Like I said, I am very much one of those, plant my flag next to the river of truth and then weather the storm kind of people. Because I do believe in capital T truth. I always love the story of Cato, where he refused to acquiesce to the rise of Caesar. And maybe a lot of people saw his death, his final kind of like, I refuse to live under Caesar moment as futile. But in a lot of ways, hundreds and hundreds of years later, the American Republic came into existence based on a lot of the same ideas that they had discovered in the Roman Republic that Cato had believed in. And if we believe in a truth that exists outside of ourselves, and there's strength in standing with that truth, and in believing that as long as we stand by our convictions and trust in the strength of our convictions, that sooner or later the winds will change, the cycle will turn, and we'll have an opportunity to make our case again. And that's kind of how I view everything that I do and everything I'm involved in.
I'd like to just have my closing argument actually just be what Justin said. Just can you loop that over my video of myself? Because I mean, like, I could not have said that.
With AI, we can do all kinds of amazing things now. It'll look just like
you're gonna deep fake Justin into my corner too.
There you go.
Incidentally, As if we could would be a wonderful name for a podcast to follow up. Are we right? But again, it's I think if we're planting our flag, then we plant it in truth, and then we also plant it in other permanent things, other things that can weather the storm. I think those things that are eternal, the things that are part of our local lives that we touch, our family, community, faith, things like that, and not just ideas, but also why those, and not just truth, but why those ideas and why truth matter, in order to sort of make a I alluded to the giant wall to protect us from the winter that's coming, but something like that, so that, you know, even if the so-called scroll of truth is dug up years from now, at least it survives for it to be discovered whenever that cycle comes back around again.
I think for me, one important thing to remember is that in trying to answer this big question that we've challenged ourselves with this evening, there are multiple answers to it. There are many things to be done. There are many things to be done kind of at all levels. As I've mentioned earlier, most of my professional work has been within the nonprofit world and the ideas world. There are things to be done that have to go with reform of political parties, that have to do with political organizing. We don't have to do all of them. And it does get overwhelming when you start listing the litany of all of it. But pick the thing that you're involved in and that you can do and that you can actually make some kind of impact with, and be content with all of that. I mean, you cannot lose your mind over forces and things that you are not in complete control of. You can dislike them, and you can say that you think that it's bad, it is not productive for the country, it's not good for our national health, and you should say those things. But, you know, if you're absolutely unable to control all of those outcomes, and nobody is able to control all of those outcomes, then you shouldn't fret over them in the way that I think people look at a big question like that and go, there's no easy answer to this. And that's right. There's no easy answer, and there's no single answer. There are multiple answers, and people are going to have to start doing things and acting and behaving in ways that they would like to see other people act and behave. I think that is the one thing that we can do and should try to comport ourselves in a way that is an example for others, especially in the face of some of the nastiness that we see in all of the politics at the moment. So I would say really just zoom out from the big question and zoom back in on your own individual lives and the things that you can do and the things that you can affect. And then try not to let the awfulness of the rest of it bother you too much. And know that there are people who are working on other things. And, you know, if everybody does their part in it, we can make things better.
One of the things you, the listener, you, the watcher, the viewer, can tangibly do if you're interested in the Conservative Project, of course, is follow the Saving Elephants YouTube channel or subscribe to the podcast. Every new subscriber or follower we get, puppy gets its wings. So you would be making the world a little bit better of a place. I definitely want to thank Justin, Cal, and Eric for a stimulating conversation. I'm hoping this will be the first of many live streams in this tumultuous political year. And quite frankly, no matter who sits on the Iron Throne after January 1, I'm sure there will be plenty of things to complain about. I do at some point want to have a more a mix of those of us who are in much agreement and a more diverse ideological cast, to possibly get a little bit broader perspective on some of these interesting, perplexing issues. But again, thank you guys for watching. Thank you, gentlemen, for participating. I've definitely enjoyed this, and we will have to have you all back on very soon.
Thank you.